A seamstress married a sick widower, without knowing he was secretly a wealthy duke of the realm. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, Evelyn Carter, a young seamstress whose fingers were more familiar with needle and thread than with comfort or rest. On a chilly evening when the wind slipped through every crack in the thin wooden walls, she sat hunched over a worn oak table, a single candle fighting against the shadows. The flame trembled each time the wind rattled the loose window pane, tossing her slight figure into alternating bands of light and darkness as she bent over a faded blue dress that was not hers and never would be. Her eyes burned from hours of stitching, but she kept going, the soft pull of thread through fabric the only steady sound in the cramped room. Her mother lay on a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, a gray blanket tucked up to her chin, breathing shallow but even for the moment. A chipped ceramic cup rested on the small stand beside her, the bitter smell of cheap medicine lingering in the air. Just as Evelyn knotted the last stitch, a heavy knock shook the door, 3 blunt raps that made the candle jump. She froze, thread between her fingers, then carefully set the dress aside and wiped her hands on her simple cotton skirt. When she opened the door, the landlord stood there, his coat buttoned tight, his breath clouding in the cold night air. He did not step inside. Instead, he held out a folded paper already creased and smudged, as if many hands had pressed its message in before it reached her. "Miss Carter," he said, not unkind but not warm either. "This is the final notice." She accepted the paper with steady fingers. Inside, careful handwriting stated in firm lines how much she owed, by which date it must be paid, and what would happen if it was not. She read every word, twice, while the landlord shifted his weight on the step. "I understand," she said quietly, lifting her gaze to meet his. "You'll have your answer before the week is done." He nodded, almost relieved that she did not plead, and left her alone with the thin door and the thicker silence. Evelyn closed it gently, turning the latch as if shutting out more than just the cold, then leaned her forehead against the wood for a brief heartbeat before walking back to the table. She unfolded the notice again and laid it flat beside the dress, as if comparing 2 pieces of fabric. One, a garment finished, the other, a life still trying to hold its seams together. She thought of the hours it would take to sew enough dresses, mend enough coats, hem enough skirts to pay that number on the page. The answer was simple. There were not enough hours in a week, not for 1 pair of hands and 1 candle. Down in the narrow street, voices rose and fell. Neighbors talking about work at the docks, about rising prices, about rumors of a grand estate outside town where a reclusive widower lived apart from the world. Some said he was gentle but strange. Some said he was gravely ill. Others whispered that he needed someone to keep his house and care for his child. Evelyn heard the echoes drift up through the thin glass, but did not let herself be carried by them. She walked to her mother's bedside, adjusted the blanket, and brushed a loose strand of hair away from the older woman's pale forehead. "We'll be all right," she murmured, more promise than certainty. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest toll of a distant bell from the direction of the countryside, where dark trees lined the road that led to a house she had never seen. And somewhere beyond the town's last flicker of light, a man who called himself Thomas Hale sat alone in a modest, carefully chosen house, a silver pocket watch resting in his palm, listening to the same wind and wondering whether the stranger who would soon change his fate had already felt the walls closing in around her. The next morning arrived pale and thin, with a colorless sky pressing low over the narrow street, as if it too were tired. Evelyn slept only, in short pieces of time between turning over numbers in her mind, but at last she rose, tied back her hair, and lit the small stove to warm water for tea. Her mother watched her from the bed with that quiet, worried love that always made Evelyn straighten her shoulders a little more than she felt she could. As she set a chipped cup in her mother's hands, there was another knock at the door, softer this time, careful, as if the visitor did not wish to disturb the neighbors. When Evelyn opened it, She found Reverend Moore standing there, dark coat buttoned, scarf neatly wrapped at his neck, his gloved hands folded over a worn leather book. His kind eyes moved past her for a moment, noting the cramped room, the thin blankets, the dress folded on the table beside the landlord's notice. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "may I speak with you, just for a short while?" He insisted on not taking her only chair, so he remained standing by the door while she stepped aside. Her mother inclined her head from the bed, and he nodded back with respectful gravity. "I have been approached," he began, weighing each word, "by a man who wishes to make an unusual request. His name is Thomas Hale. He lives on the edge of town, in a small house near the line of trees. He is a widower, in poor health, with a young daughter who has not spoken since her mother passed." Evelyn listened without interrupting, her hands folding around themselves. Reverend Moore went on. "He asked me to find a woman of good character, not someone proud or after wealth, someone steady. He wishes to offer marriage. In return, he would provide a safe home and care for her family. He said he would be content with respect and honesty, if affection never grows." The word marriage seemed to hang in the cold air like breath that refused to vanish. Evelyn looked from his face to her mother, who had gone very still, fingers tightening around the warm cup. "Why me?" she asked at last, her voice even. "He has seen you at services," Reverend Moore replied. "He spoke of the way you support your mother, the way you work without complaint. Jonas, the man who sometimes buys fabric from your shop for his employer, confirmed that you are trustworthy. Mr. Hale does not wish for romance. He wishes for peace." It would have been easy to be insulted, to think of herself as a convenient solution, but Evelyn felt something else instead, a slow, heavy calculation pressing against her ribs. Reverend Moore left after a modest prayer, promising that there was no obligation, only a choice. When the door clicked shut, the room fell into a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite painful. Her mother spoke first. "You do not owe anyone your life, Evelyn," she said quietly. "Not even me. But a roof and safety are not small things." Evelyn sat at the edge of the bed and took her mother's hand, tracing the thin blue lines under the skin. "If I do this," she said, "it will not be because we are defeated. It will be because I chose it over the street." Later that day, she walked to the church again. The sky had cleared a little, light catching on the wet stones of the path. In the side room where Reverend Moore sometimes met with parishioners, a man rose when she entered. He was taller than she expected, his frame wrapped in a plain dark coat, his shoulders a little stooped, as if the effort of standing took more from him than it should. His hair was dark with threads of silver at his temples, and his skin carried the pale tone of someone who had seen too little sun. Yet his eyes were sharp, a deep gray that missed very little. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice rough as if from illness but controlled. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." She inclined her head, her hands folded in front of her. "Reverend Moore said you wished to offer a proposal," she replied. "I do not have time for games, Mr. Hale. My mother is ill, and our situation is urgent." For a moment, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite pain, as if he recognized himself in her bluntness. "That is precisely why I thought of you," he said. "You see clearly. I will not promise love. I cannot promise health. But I can promise that your mother will never fear eviction again, and that you will not face the winter alone." The candle on the small table between them burned with a steady flame, its light glinting off the modest silver ring that lay beside his folded hand, waiting for an answer. For a long moment Evelyn simply looked at the modest silver ring on the table, the small circle of metal that suddenly seemed heavier than the notice of debt lying back in her room. Her first instinct was to retreat, to ask for time, to take this strange offer and turn it over in her mind as she did with patterns and seams. But time was the one luxury she did not have. She thought of the landlord's shoes on the threshold, of her mother's tired breathing, of winters when the wind cut through every layer of fabric as if it were nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "If I agree, Mr. Hale, I need you to understand something," she said. "I do not know you. I do not expect affection, and I know you do not promise it. But I require respect. I will not be treated as a servant who happens to wear a ring." His eyes sharpened, not offended, but almost interested. "You would have your own small income from your sewing if you wished to continue," he replied. "You would have say over the household. and your mother would be provided for. I will not demand more than you can give. I ask only that you do not abandon my daughter, even if you never care for me." That last sentence was more naked than she expected, the honesty of it so plain that it startled her more than any polished declaration could have. She studied him then, not as a stranger, but the way she studied fabric, testing for strength, for hidden flaws, for how it would wear over time. His hands were those of a man who had not done hard labor, the fingers long and well-shaped, but there were faint scars along the knuckles, as if once upon a time he had not been as careful as he was now. His coat was plain, but the stitching was precise, too precise for a man with no eye for quality. "I will agree," she said at last, each word falling like a small stone into still water, sending ripples outward. "On the terms we have spoken, and I will not pretend to be someone I am not." Something like relief moved behind his controlled expression. He slid the ring closer to her on the table, but he did not reach for her hand to place it there himself. Instead, he allowed her the choice to pick it up or leave it lying. Evelyn took it, surprised by how cool the metal felt against her skin, and slipped it onto her finger. The fit was almost exact, as if measured. A day later, under a sky the color of worn pewter, they stood in front of Reverend Moore in the nearly empty church. There were no flowers on the altar, no music beyond the faint echo of the minister's voice in the high, simple space. Her mother sat in the front pew, wrapped in her best shawl, her eyes bright with unshed tears that were not entirely sadness. A man she did not know, graying at the temples and with the dignified bearing of an old servant, stood behind Thomas with his hands folded. This, she would later learn, was Jonas. The vows were spoken in clear, careful voices. When it was Evelyn's turn, her lips did not tremble. She promised to share his name, his home, and his burdens, as far as her strength allowed. Love was not mentioned. When it was done, Reverend Moore wrote their names into the church registry, the pen scratching softly on the paper. Evelyn watched the way Thomas signed, the letters shaped with an old habit of formality that did not quite belong to a man of simple means. The detail lodged in the back of her mind like a pin stuck into fabric for later. There was no feast, only warm bread and a bit of stew at the parsonage. Soon after, Evelyn kissed her mother's cheek and promised to send word once she had settled. Then she climbed into the simple carriage that waited outside, her small trunk at her feet, her gloved hands folded over the new ring on her finger. Thomas sat across from her, his posture careful, as if even the motion of the carriage might strain his strength. As the horse started forward and the town slipped slowly behind them, Evelyn looked out at the narrow streets she had always known, the laundry lines strung between windows, the faint smoke rising from cramped chimneys. Ahead, the road stretched toward the edge of town, where trees gathered, in a dark line against the late afternoon sky. Somewhere beyond that line of trees, her new life waited in a house she had never seen, with a man whose secrets she could already sense, even if she did not yet understand their shape. The road out of town narrowed as the carriage moved past the last cluster of small brick houses and into the stretch of land where fields and wild hedges took over. Evelyn sat with her back straight and her hands folded, watching the world change through the small glass window. The familiar sounds of the market faded, replaced by the softer rhythm of the horse's hooves and the rustle of bare branches arching overhead. Opposite her, Thomas sat with his eyes half closed, as if measuring his breath, his gloved hand resting lightly on the head of his cane. Every so often a faint cough shook him, but he covered it with a handkerchief and a short nod, as though apologizing to the air rather than to her. "It is not far now," he said at last, his voice quieter than the creak of the carriage frame. "The house is simple, but it is peaceful. Peace is not something I have had in excess." Evelyn replied, not unkindly. "I will not object to finding even a small measure of it." The corners of his eyes softened at that, as if he recognized a shared fatigue. They fell into a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable, each retreating into private thought while the road carried them forward. At last the carriage turned through a low wooden gate and onto a short drive lined with trees. The house that came into view was modest in size, built of pale stone that had weathered into gentle softness, with a dark roof and a narrow porch. It was not grand, not in the way of the large estates people whispered about, but it had an air of being carefully tended. The windows were clean, the small front garden outlined with stones set into the earth by a patient hand. When the carriage stopped, Jonas stepped forward to open the door. Up close, his age was more evident in the fine lines around his eyes, but his movements were precise and smooth, like a man who had spent many years in formal service. "Welcome, madam," he said, bowing his head slightly. The word madam rested oddly on Evelyn's shoulders, like a cloak a little too large, but she acknowledged him with a small nod and stepped down onto the packed earth, feeling the solidity of the ground under her boots. Before she could say more, she sensed another gaze upon her. A little girl stood just inside the doorway, half hidden by the frame. She was slight, with dark hair neatly brushed back and held by a plain ribbon. Her dress was simple but well made, the hem just above her ankles. Her hands clutched a cloth doll to her chest, the fabric worn soft from much holding. Her eyes, a clear gray mirror of Thomas's, watched Evelyn with a seriousness far older than her years. "Lucy," Thomas said gently, "this is Evelyn. She will be staying with us." The child did not speak. She only looked from her father to Evelyn, as if measuring the new presence against a list she could not yet name. Evelyn did not approach too quickly. Instead, she reached into her small bag and drew out a bit of colored thread she had saved, a slender strand of deep red. She wrapped it lightly around her own finger, then unwound it and let it rest over the doll's cloth arm. "This is for you," Evelyn said quietly. "If you ever want me to come closer, you can hold this, and I will understand." A flicker of interest warmed Lucy's gaze. Her fingers loosened on the doll, just enough to touch the thread. She did not smile, not yet, but something in her posture relaxed by the smallest measure. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and something gently herbal, perhaps dried leaves hanging from the beams in the small kitchen. The front room held a sturdy sofa and 2 chairs, the upholstery plain but without tiers. On a side table near the window, Evelyn noticed a silver pocket watch lying open, its face bright in the afternoon light. The craftsmanship was finer than anything she had seen in the homes of ordinary clerks. A bookcase stood along one wall, the shelves lined with volumes whose spines carried gold lettering that had faded with use rather than neglect. It did not match the impression of a man who lived only on a modest income. In a narrow hallway, she passed a small framed drawing of a grand building with towers and wide stone steps, its windows like watching eyes. She paused. "Is that a place you visited, Mr. Hale?" she asked. Thomas's gaze followed hers, and for a heartbeat an unreadable expression crossed his face. "It is a place that belonged to someone I once knew," he answered carefully. "We will speak of it another time." Evelyn let the subject rest, but the image fixed itself in her memory alongside the feel of the ring on her finger and the weight of the landlord's notice now lying useless on her old table in town. As evening began to gather at the windows, she stood in the middle of this new, quiet house, aware of the little girl watching her from the doorway and the man who seemed both present and held at a distance by thoughts he did not share. It felt less like stepping into a new life and more like opening a door into a room where a story had already begun without her, one whose missing pieces she had not yet been invited to see. The first days in the new house settled around Evelyn like a cloak she was still deciding whether to keep on her shoulders. Morning light slipped through the front windows in narrow bands, touching the edges of the furniture and the worn rug in the sitting room. She woke before the others, out of habit, and found comfort in the simple tasks of boiling water, setting out cups, and learning where every plate and spoon had been kept by hands that were not hers. Jonas moved quietly through the kitchen, already familiar with each creak in the floor. He prepared the fire with practiced ease, then stepped back to let her take over. "If there is anything you require, madam, I am at your disposal," he said. His tone was respectful, but there was a steadiness beneath it, as if he had seen many households rise and fall and did not intend to be easily unsettled by one more change. "I will ask if I need help," Evelyn replied, "but I am used to working with my own hands." That answer seemed to please him. He inclined his head and turned his attention to polishing the silver, which did not quite match the modest size of the house. The pieces were too fine, the patterns too intricate, with small crowns and birds etched along their edges. Evelyn noticed, but she did not comment. After breakfast, Thomas withdrew to the small room he used as a study. Evelyn watched him go, noting the slight stiffness in his step, the careful way he leaned on his cane. Illness had carved itself into his movements, but it had not taken his awareness. He paused at the doorway, glancing back at Lucy, who sat at the table with a slate and chalk. "You may go to the garden later if you wish," he told his daughter. "Stay where the house can see you." Lucy nodded, her eyes flicking briefly toward Elvyn, as if to check whether the new presence in their life would object. Elvyn offered a small smile. "If you like, I can mend your doll's dress this afternoon," she said. "A lady should be properly turned out, even if she is made of cloth." A tiny spark of something close to amusement touched Lucy's gaze. She did not speak, but she slid the doll a little closer to the edge of the table, an unspoken agreement. When Thomas had closed the study door, Elvyn turned her attention to the rest of the house. She moved from room to room, opening curtains, straightening cushions, and learning the sounds each door made when it opened and closed. In a bedroom she understood to be his, she paused at the neatly made bed and the small table beside it. There, among a glass of water and a folded handkerchief, lay a small wooden box with a simple brass clasp. It was nothing like the ornate objects in the drawing she had seen in the hall, yet something about the care with which it was placed made her fingers itch with curiosity. She did not touch it. Instead, she dusted around it, careful not to disturb its position. In the afternoons, she set up a small sewing corner near the window where the light was best. Word spread quickly in the nearby village that Mrs. Hale, the new wife of the quiet widower, was skilled with a needle. Women began to appear at the door with skirts to be hemmed, sleeves to be narrowed, children's clothes to be let out for a second or third season. Elvyn listened more than she spoke, and the conversations stitched themselves together into a pattern. They spoke of a great estate farther beyond the trees, of a noble house where the Duke had fallen ill and withdrawn from the world. Some said he was gone entirely. Others whispered that his relatives were already making decisions in his name. One afternoon, as a customer left, Elvyn stepped outside to watch the road. The air held the cool edge of late autumn. In the distance, between the bare branches, she caught a glimpse of stone high on a far rise, just a suggestion of towers against the pale sky. It might have been the same building from the drawing in the hall. Standing there, with the hem of her plain dress brushing the doorstep, she felt the strange pull of it like a thread tied around her wrist, tugging her toward a story she had not asked to enter. Behind her, the floorboard by the study door creaked. Thomas watched her for a moment, one hand on the frame. "The countryside takes some getting used to," he said after a pause. "There is more space for one's thoughts. And for one's questions," Elvyn answered. She did not turn away from the distant outline of stone. "I will not ask them all at once. But I will not pretend I do not have them." There was a quiet in the way he breathed out, not quite resignation, not quite relief. "When it is safe to answer," he said, "I will." It was a strange choice of words, she thought, as she stepped back into the house. Safe to answer, as if the truth itself were a dangerous thing that had to be handled with care, like a needle too sharp for careless fingers. The days shortened as late autumn leaned toward winter, and the light that entered the house each morning arrived later and left sooner. In that shrinking band of daylight, a fragile rhythm began to form. Elvyn stitched while Lucy traced hesitant shapes on her slate. Jonas carried wood and polished silver that seemed too fine for such a quiet dwelling. Thomas moved between the study and the sitting room like a man pacing carefully along the edge of some invisible line. One evening, the air outside hung damp and cold, pressing a faint mist against the window panes. Elvyn had just finished clearing the supper dishes when she heard a soft, uneven step in the hall. She turned to see Thomas standing there, one hand braced on the wall, the other clutching his cane. His face looked more pale than usual, and there was a tightness around his mouth that he could not quite hide. "You should sit," she said at once, crossing the room with a practical firmness that left no room for pride. She guided him to the armchair nearest the fire. When he sank into it, his shoulders eased as if a weight had been set down for the first time all day. Jonas appeared with a cup of something steaming, the faint scent of herbs rising in the air. He placed it within easy reach, his eyes meeting Elvyn's for a brief moment, sharing an unspoken concern. "Thank you," Thomas murmured, taking the cup. Elvyn watched his hands as he lifted it. The fingers trembled slightly, but the grip itself was strong, controlled. She noticed again the faint scars along his knuckles, thin pale lines that did not belong to a man who had always lived a careful, sheltered life. Lucy hovered near the doorway, her doll held close. She watched her father with a worry that she did not yet have words for. Evelyn moved to the fire, adjusting the logs to coax out more warmth. As she did, her gaze fell on the mantel. There, beside a simple candlestick, lay the silver pocket watch she had seen before, but tonight the case sat open, its inner lid turned toward the room. Gently etched into the metal was a small raised crest, a crowned bird in flight. It was the same bird she had seen on the polished silverware and in the framed drawing in the hall, the one of the distant estate. It was not a design chosen at random in a market stall. It was a mark of belonging. That symbol, she said quietly, nodding toward it, appears often in this house for a man who claims nothing more than a modest past. Thomas followed her gaze. For a heartbeat, there was no expression at all on his face, as if he had slipped behind a wall. Then he closed the watch gently and turned it over in his palm, hiding the crest. It belonged to a family who thought their name would shield them from everything, he answered. They were mistaken. The words were simple, but something in his voice made Lucy shift, as if she recognized the shadow of a story she had lived through even if she had not heard it spoken. Before Evelyn could press further, Jonas cleared his throat softly from the doorway. He held an envelope in his hand, the paper thick and edged with a weight that suggested importance. A dark red seal had been broken cleanly, the wax bearing an impression of the same crowned bird, though the details were smoothed from repeated use. A message arrived from the main road, sir, Jonas said, his tone carefully controlled. From town first, and then beyond. He glanced at Evelyn as if to ask silently whether this was a conversation she should witness. Thomas studied her in the firelight, measuring, weighing, the way she had once measured cloth. At last he spoke. You may stay, he told her. You are part of what this concerns now, whether I wish that or not. Jonas stepped forward and placed the envelope on the small table. Evelyn could see the name written in an elegant, practiced hand. It did not read Thomas Hale. It read Adrian Hale, followed by a title she did not yet fully understand, and beneath that, a second name in the closing line. Lord Marcus Hale. The letters sat between them like another presence in the room. Outside, the mist pressed harder against the glass. Inside, Evelyn felt that somewhere beyond the ordinary walls of their modest house, very large doors were beginning to move, and that the man she had married bore more keys than he had ever admitted. For a long moment after Jonas set the envelope down, no one spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked with deliberate patience, marking each second that the truth remained folded in cream-colored paper between them. Evelyn saw the name written there, clear and firm in dark ink, and felt something inside her shift. Adrian Hale. The second line, written in a slightly smaller but no less confident hand, carried a title that belonged not to any modest clerk or bookkeeper, but to a man whose decisions shaped the lives of hundreds. Beneath that, in the closing, was another name, Lord Marcus Hale. She lifted her eyes to Thomas, or Adrian, or whatever his name truly was, and saw that he was watching her with the stillness of someone who has run out of places to hide. How long, she asked quietly, have you been two men at once? Lucy stood very still by the doorway, her doll pressed to her chest, eyes moving from her father's face to Evelyn's. Jonas shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, but he did not leave. If anything, his presence seemed to brace the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Thomas, or Adrian, reached for the envelope and opened it fully, smoothing it flat with careful hands. Since before my daughter was born, he answered at last. The world calls me Adrian Hale, Duke of Ravensfield. I asked you to marry Thomas Hale because I needed one part of my life that was not chained to that name. The word Duke rang in the small room like a distant bell, soft but impossible to ignore. Evelyn had heard it whispered in the village, tied to that distant stone estate beyond the trees, spoken with awe and resentment in equal measure. Now it sat between them on the simple wooden table, next to the plain cup and the modest lamp, as if it belonged here as easily as anywhere else. So you are not only a widower, she said, her voice steady, and not only a man of modest means. You are the man in that drawing, the man people talk about when they speak of Ravensfield. He inclined his head, every movement measured. My wife died in that house. There were questions about how and why. I fell ill soon after in a way that was not entirely natural. The physicians did what they could, but the more I retreated, the more my cousin Marcus stepped forward as a guardian of the estate. It became convenient for many to imagine I would not return. He did not describe the illness in detail. He did not need to. Evelyn could see the memory in the way his fingers tightened on the edge of the table, the way his shoulders held themselves against some old weight. "And so you left," she said. "You let the world believe one story while you lived another. You found a small house and a smaller name. And then you needed a wife and chose a seamstress who did not know that by saying yes to a sick man, she was also saying yes to a title she had never been told about." There was no heat in her words, only a quiet, deliberate clarity that cut through the haze of the evening. "I needed someone beyond the reach of the people who smile at me in bright rooms and plan over my absence," he replied. "Someone who would see Lucy first and land second. Someone who would not be impressed by my name because she did not know it." His gaze did not leave her face. "I thought if I told you, you would walk away. I told myself that giving you shelter and security was enough payment for the risk I placed on your shoulders." It was a coward's reasoning. Evelyn let the honesty of that admission settle over her. She thought of her mother in the narrow bed back in town, now safe from eviction. She thought of Lucy, silent and watchful, clutching that thread she had given her like a small promise. She thought of herself, standing here in a house that was both sanctuary and doorway to a world she had never wanted. "You were right about one thing," she said slowly. "If you had told me everything at first, I might have walked away. Not because of who you are, but because of what comes with it. But at least the choice would have been mine. You took that from me." The hurt in her voice was soft rather than loud, but it was real. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, as if accepting a verdict he had expected but still dreaded. "If you wish to leave now, I will not stop you," he said. "Your mother will remain provided for. You will be free of my name and whatever storm it may call down." Evelyn looked down at her hands, at the plain silver ring that had seemed like a lifeline when she first slipped it on. Now it felt like a knot tied between two very different lives. She glanced at Lucy, whose small face had gone pale, her eyes wide with a fear she finally understood. The child took one tiny step toward her, the red thread wrapped carefully around her fingers. Evelyn felt the pull of that thread like another kind of title, one she had chosen the moment she placed it there. "I may yet decide what I will do as your wife," she said, lifting her chin. "But as Lucy's guardian, I am staying. At least until I am certain she will not be used as a piece on someone else's board." For the first time that evening, something eased in Lucy's posture. She crossed the last bit of distance between them and slipped her free hand into Evelyn's. Adrian watched this small movement as if it were the only light in the room. He bowed his head, not as a duke acknowledging a subject, but as a man acknowledging the cost of his own secrets. Somewhere out beyond the misted windows, the great stone house of Ravensfield stood waiting, but in that modest sitting room, a different kind of decision had just been made, as quiet and irrevocable as a stitch pulled tight. The letter that had lain so still on the table did not remain quiet once Adrian unfolded it fully. Evelyn watched his eyes move line by line, the flicker of the fire picking up the tension in his jaw. When he finished, he passed it to Jonas, who read with the measured calm of a man who had seen unwelcome messages before. Only when both men had absorbed its contents did Evelyn reach for the paper herself. She read the elegant script, each loop and flourish betraying a writer certain of his own position. Lord Marcus Hale requested, in language that was courteous only on the surface, that Adrian present himself at Ravensfield within a fortnight. There would be a gathering, he wrote, to discuss the future administration of the estate given Adrian's prolonged absence and questionable health. The words were wrapped in concern, but every sentence pressed toward the same conclusion. If Adrian did not step back into the light, others would step into it for him. "He is dressing a demand in polite clothing," Evelyn said, lowering the letter. "If you do not go, he will say you are unfit. If you do go, he will attempt to control the story in a room he has already arranged." "Precisely," Jonas replied quietly. "The guest will be carefully chosen. Many will already have been told a version of events that suits his purposes." Adrian stared into the fire, the light reflecting in his eyes like something distant and restless. "For 2 years he has acted in my stead," he said. "At first with my reluctant permission. Then, with increasing enthusiasm, I allowed it out of necessity and weakness. The longer I remained away, the deeper his roots went. Evelyn considered this for a moment, then folded the letter back along its original creases. Then you cannot send a polite refusal, she said. But you also cannot walk into his hall as if you were still the man who left it. That man trusted the wrong people. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing not only a seamstress who had married him out of desperation, but a mind that refused to be intimidated by polished handwriting or stone walls. "What would you suggest, Mrs. Hale?" he asked. The use of the modest name sat oddly on his tongue now that she knew the weight of the one that truly belonged to him. "I would suggest that you decide which story you wish to tell before he tells it for you," Evelyn answered. "If you arrive alone, it will seem as if you are still hiding something. If you bring your daughter and the wife that nobody expects, you will be forcing those people to see you as more than an illness and a signature on a document." Lucy, who had been listening with the wide eyes of a child who understands more than adults think, tightened her hold on the red thread around her fingers. "You want to take her there?" Adrian's voice held not objection, but fear. "That house has not been kind to the women who lived in it." "Then perhaps it needs to see a different kind of woman," Evelyn replied softly. "I will not allow her to be placed where she feels unsafe. But I will also not let your cousin convince the world that you are a shadow to be brushed aside. He is counting on your silence." Silence is a convenient thing for people like him. Jonas cleared his throat, a thoughtful sound. "If you go, hi." He caught himself before he finished the title and adjusted. "If you go, sir, there will be those among the staff who remember you and who are not loyal to Lord Marcus. I can send a message ahead, quietly. There are still eyes and ears in that place who do not belong to him." The decision, once spoken aloud, did not roar into the room. It settled instead, like snow beginning to fall, soft but sure. Adrian's shoulders straightened slowly, as if he were standing up inside his own life for the first time in far too long. "Very well," he said. "We will go to Ravensfield. Jonas, do what you must. Evelyn, I will not ask you to come, but—" he hesitated, the next words heavier than any title. "If you walk into that house at my side, I will owe you more than any vow I have spoken." Evelyn looked at Lucy, at the thread, at the quiet hope and fear tangled together in the child's expression. Then she nodded once. "We will go," she said. "And whatever they expect to see when they open those doors, it will not be the truth standing before them that frightens them. It will be the fact that you have finally decided to stop hiding." Outside, somewhere beyond the dark line of trees, the stone silhouette of Ravensfield waited against the night sky, unaware that the people who would soon pass through its gates were not the ones it remembered. The day they left for Ravensfield dawned pale and cold, with a thin frost tracing patterns along the edges of the window panes. Evelyn dressed in her best dark dress, the one she had altered more times than she could count. It seemed strengthened by hidden stitches. She braided her hair with careful hands, not to impress the people they were going to meet, but to remind herself that there were parts of her life she still controlled. In the small bedroom next door, she helped Lucy into a woolen coat and wrapped a soft scarf around the child's neck. The red thread remained looped around Lucy's wrist, a tiny streak of color against the gray of the morning. "If you feel afraid," Evelyn said gently, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes, "you may hold this tighter. It will not change the house we are going to, but it will remind you that you are not alone in it." Lucy nodded, her lips pressed together, and slipped her hand into Evelyn's. Downstairs, Jonas had already loaded their modest trunks onto the carriage. Adrian waited by the door, dressed more formally than she had ever seen him in their quiet village life. His coat was of finer cloth, his waistcoat cut precisely, the lines of his clothing hinting at a man who once stood in rooms where every eye turned to follow him. Yet his face carried the same tired shadows, the same caution. When he offered his hand to help Evelyn into the carriage, there was a gravity to the gesture, as if he understood that this step was not just onto a wooden ledge, but into a story that would no longer allow halfway truths. The road to Ravensfield wound through fields edged with bare trees and low stone walls, then climbed gradually toward higher ground. As they approached, the estate revealed itself in pieces. First the tops of trees shaped by careful pruning, then the distant line of a high outer wall, and finally the broad facade of the house itself. Ravensfield rose from the land like a memory carved in stone, its many windows reflecting the pale sky, its central steps sweeping up to heavy doors that had opened and closed on generations of lives. Lucy pressed closer to Elvyn as the carriage rolled beneath the archway. Stable hands came forward, their eyes widening slightly when they saw who stepped out. Some bowed quickly, almost instinctively, before schooling their faces back into polite neutrality. Word had traveled ahead of them, Elvyn realized. Jonas must have done more than send messages. He had stirred old loyalties. The great front doors opened before they reached them. A line of indoor staff waited in the wide entrance hall, their uniforms dark against the pale stone floor. At the far end of the line, at the base of the grand staircase, stood a man in a finely tailored suit, his posture relaxed, his expression composed. He was not young, but he carried himself with the ease of someone who had grown comfortable in important rooms. His hair was touched with silver at the temples, his smile measured, his eyes cool and assessing. "Cousin," he said, spreading his hands as they approached. "It is a relief to see you standing here at last. We have all been so very concerned." His gaze flicked briefly to Elvyn and Lucy, taking their measure as if they were items on an inventory. Elvyn felt the weight of that look and straightened her back a fraction. If he meant to make her feel small, he would have to work harder. Adrian's reply was calm, his voice carrying easily in the vast hall. "Lord Marcus," he said, "you have been busy in my absence." There was no accusation in the words, but there was no gratitude either. Marcus's smile did not falter. "Necessity, dear Adrian," he said smoothly. "The world does not kindly pause for illness. I have merely steered the ship until the captain could return. And now here you are, with a new wife and your daughter. How very unexpected." Elvyn met his gaze directly when he looked at her again. She did not curtsy. Instead, she inclined her head with quiet dignity. "Elvyn Carter Hale," she said. "Your cousin's wife." The hall seemed to hold that simple introduction for a moment, as if the stone itself were listening. Marcus's smile thinned almost imperceptibly, the first hairline crack in a polished surface. "Welcome to Ravensfield, Mrs. Hale," he replied. "I hope you will find it instructive." Elvyn felt Adrian's presence steady at her side, not as a shield, but as a companion facing the same storm. She tightened her hold on Lucy's hand and took the final step over the threshold, fully aware that the house was studying her as closely as any of its inhabitants. Whatever this place had been before, whatever stories it had held of loss and quiet harm, it would now have to make room for something new. A duke who had chosen to stop disappearing, a child who refused to be forgotten, and a seamstress who had not been asked if she was ready to stand in these halls, but who stood in them anyway.